Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to go over the API gateway concept and terminology very quickly. Thank you very much and stay with me. So what is an API that we hear a lot, right? So application programming interface. That is something that allows you to interact with different applications. It's a language. It's a communication language that allows you to just communicate and interact with different type of applications. That means that with the different command sets like get, put, post, you have the option to just read things, write things, or execute things, whatever you want to do. Basically, nowadays, whenever you open up your browser and start doing something with your browser, everything in the back is translated to the API that you could see. So we're going to just further deep dive into the API, and we know that this API or this kind of permissions or this kind of interactions with the applications, they would higher the risk of, applications be vulnerable to any type of threats. So well, API security vulnerabilities. The most well-known, mostly used APIs, REST and SOAP, they got their own vulnerabilities, like broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, broken access control, lack of TLS, man in the middle, or visibility in the network, parameter tampering, and on the SOAP side, we got XML SQL injection and cross-site scripting, as well as the others. Each one of these, they got extensive, description, and you have to just get into the description of each of these ones. The OWASP is the well-known organization that publishes, the security controls against all these vulnerabilities, and it does provide you with a top 10 that most of the WAF or the security protection devices or web application firewalls, they would just try to just control and protect against the most well-known vulnerabilities that are published by OWASP. Having all the vulnerabilities for the API and which makes API basically vulnerable to whatever attack or attempt that is going to be available in the market or in the industry will just make us think about a device or a way or an appliance that could be possibly standardized and just put in the way to make the API, those API communications secure. So API, why do we need an API gateway? For microservices security. Microservices, they are really popular in the industry. Whether you are in payment, whether you are in any kind of, financial transactions or any type of applications that you're servicing or you're just presenting to the public, or either you're using as a SaaS or any type of cloud services or internal applications, whatever has got the API, it might be to some extent using the Kubernetes like microservices architecture, that instead of having just one application on one system, either virtual or physical, you just distribute the load with many or multiple instances of smaller applications that they interact with one another. Of course, it higher the risk. Whenever you use the distributed environment, your processing power will increase, but your security will be less in terms of the amount of, effort that you need to just ensure different distributed components. They would just securely communicate and they're authentic, of course. Anyways, API authentication. So whenever you want to access a resource or you want to just attempt to do an API interaction, of course, the first thing is your identity and authentication. That you have to make sure, you have to prove that you're the right one, that you're doing that thing, because it could be a dangerous interaction, right? Input validation. many of the attacks, they just start with input, malformed input, right? So if the input is the right input, um, it has to be detected by the API gateway. So malform input or the whatever that you want to just give to the API and make the API go like uh, overwhelmed or overloaded will be prevented by the API gateway. Faster response time. Why faster response time? Because it does have the load balancing internally, and it does know different components that it could communicate, right? So instead of directly communicating from your machine to that end machine and switching from again your machine to the different machine, API manages that for you, and it does the load balancing, of course, utilizes multiple instances. Rate limiting, that means you can control not to overwhelm or overload the whatever the application is going to be on the other end. The billing of microservices, which is another thing. So you can bill with the API, the metering, the microservices caching that hires the speed and performance, monitoring and tracking application analytics. Uh, that's again another feature of the API gateway. And of course, extending legacy applications. Some applications they don't support some of they're HTTP based, so you want to just enforce TLS and take them to a higher level or upscale them and make sure that the communications they are secure, which is a must for today's transactions. Like any other solution, there are pros and cons and downsides of the API are the response time. Although the API is there to just higher the performance, but the API itself could impose some sort of delay. That means because you adding a hop on in the way, in that it just acts like a proxy and you communicate with an API as a gateway, and then API on behalf of you makes another connection to the whoever is going to be destined or intended to be contacted, right? So this way is a broken session, and that would just add to the amount of time that is going to be required. So some of the SLAs, they may, need some sort of, specific. I just spoke about this in my previous sessions. Let's say for a payment transaction, you have a certain amount of time that it has to complete, right? So if it's taking, 150 milliseconds and your transaction is within that time frame, should be going, for checking for fraud management. Is the valid transaction? Is it a good transaction? And then go to the issuer bank or acquirer, whatever it takes, and then come back to the where you swipe your card or the POS system, right? So all the time that you have here is just a certain amount, just one, and let's say 150 milliseconds. And with all these that you have to do, if there are multiple hops added, and they're just add to the amount of time that is going to be taken to complete a transaction, that will violate your SLA, and it may not be feasible. But anyways, dependencies, that means the API will require some dependencies. That means some components are dependent on one another, and API may bring some challenges, right? Because API should communicate with multiple dependencies, and that adds some sort of complexity, which is the next one. And the security itself, securing API itself, it's another thing. So you have to consider that in mind, that the API, of course, the API security itself, as well as the reliability, and having the API like in multiple instances to conform with the availability or whatever is requirement for having a highly available um, environment would be something that you may have to consider and keep in your mind. The architecture is pretty much like a hub that you add in the way between the requester and the server. I would say it could be from server to server, machine to machine in case of Kubernetes. So if that's the case, the API gateway will just act as a middleman. It would ensure that the TLS or two-way TLS, whatever is requirement, is being established and is being communicated between the server and the client. The server being itself and the client being the machine, the requester. And on the other end, again, it has to protect the communication between itself to the intended device or the destination. In case of machine to machine or microservices, the API would just authenticate and validate the certificates because there is no user. But in terms, if there is a user to application or user to server, there should be like an authentication with, of course, assistance of like an intermediary authentication system or like a database or identity system, which could be like, let's say, LDAP directory or any kind of, cloud-based directory or identity as a service that is going to be integrated to validate the person that is an authentic and or, uh, legitimate one. So notes from this slide would be API gateway is a must in today's environment or must have security component in the architecture. So there are certain exceptions that they are, let's say, API calls, they're sending in one way massive amount of data for logging purposes or some sort of, different applications that may, for at the moment, impose or when you just balance the security against the time and effort that is going to take to do to install or add an API gateway in between would not really qualify the API gateway as a device that you need to be there. But in 90% of the cases that you may want to interact from one system to another or one from user to a system, you would definitely need an API gateway. And of course, there will be coming a video for API gateway security architecture pattern that talks about multiple use cases that we can just use the API gateway. That brings us to the end of this presentation, and thank you for watching this, and please watch for the upcoming videos. Okay, and see you later.